In keeping with regional protocol, I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and by honoring the sovereignty of the Six Nations, the Mohawk, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Seneca, and Tuscarora, and their land where we are situated and where the majority of our work takes place. In this acknowledgement, we hope to demonstrate respect for the treaties that were made on these territories and remorse for the harms and mistakes of the far and recent past. And we pledge to work toward partnership with a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So thank you for that. And really, what's deep in that acknowledgement, I think, is along with what we're going to be talking about today, collaboration and reconciliation. So the format today, I'm going to take my privilege to ask these two a few questions, get a bit into both their organizational work and their personal stories, and then we'll just really open it up for a conversation with all of you. So I would love to start. First of all, I suppose we should also say this is a bit of a departure, right? Partnership for the Public Good. We're very Buffalo, Niagara focused. That is our mission. And I come from a background of both being from Western Europe, but doing international work and peace work. And it's been truly my dream for the last couple of years to bring the two together. I think we have such incredible work happening in Buffalo in the midst of what is still a divided community by race, by income, by where we live, by the fields that we work in. And to be able to compare that with the Irish experience and Pádraig's work in Belfast and in particular in the north of Ireland is going to be really interesting. So we'll hear more about that, but I think just to begin to think, how can we relate to other places, both our experience of division, historical and what continues, and also what we're learning about how to negotiate that and move on from that as well. So with that, I'd love to kind of start by grounding in the places where you both work. So Lorna, for all of the strength and progress, here in Buffalo we remain a deeply segregated, high poverty city. How do you find yourself describing the current moment of our city? And I'd also love to know, how have things changed since you arrived here? Which are big questions.
So I'll start with how things changed, right? I came here in 1974. I came here because a man who lives here asked me to marry him, and it seemed like a good idea at the time. I fell in love with Buffalo. I was born in Mount Vernon, New York. I was raised in Philadelphia, big city. But I was living in a small town up in New Hampshire when this request came. So when I got here, this seemed like more of the kind of place I wanted to go back to. I didn't want to go back to Philadelphia. I had a lot of family in New York. I definitely didn't want to live in New York. This seemed like the right pace for me. It also seemed very backward. Frankly, it seemed backward. Didn't have a black bank, and I asked my ex-husband, I had an $800 check, I want to put it in a black bank, where's the black bank? And he looked at me like I had said, where do the Martians live? And so that was disappointing. But I fell in love with the place. It's a beautiful place. It's beautiful people. It was disappointing to find how highly segregated. I couldn't find a job as a waitress when I first got here. I found, and I had waited on table in New Hampshire while I was in college. I went to Dartmouth, and I was a good waitress. So I thought, I'll get a waitress job till I find a real job. Couldn't get one. I did find one at the Executive out by the airport, and that was, you had to wear hot pants for that. I was cute in those days. And when my ex-husband found out I would have to wear hot pants, the answer was, oh, no, I'm not coming out there every night, blah, 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 blah. So I thought, I don't really want to wear hot pants for the entertainment of white men anyway, so I didn't take the job. But I couldn't get a job at the Anchor Bar. So I still don't patronize the Anchor Bar. Just putting it out there to you. I found Buffalo to be highly segregated. I couldn't find black people working in department stores downtown. There was a black woman, some of you may remember, that ran the elevator in Burgers back in the day. She was actually famous in the black community because she worked at Burgers. Running the elevator didn't seem to bother anybody. She was actually a local dignitary because she worked for Burgers. That's the town in 1974, so I guess it's changed in that there's no longer a Burgers. But it's still very highly segregated. I retired from the Buffalo Public Schools. Well, I run this theater company, but I've always had to maintain what I call a plantation job simultaneously, because my theater company, it is 41 years old, up until a couple of years ago, was never able to afford to pay me. All the awards, all of that, all the notoriety, all the 4-star reviews mean absolutely nothing when it comes to funding. So I always had a plantation job, so I retired from the Buffalo Public Schools back in 2014, blessedly, 2014, 2015. But even inside that system, you know, the degree is a different kind of segregation now. It's a different kind of segregation. I'll talk to you about that at another time. But I promise you, there's a real segregation problem going on there. Who has what job is the question. Why are all the black people in the police style positions? Why do you go into a high school where all the teachers are white, but the administration is black? The security guards are black. What is that about? It starts to smack of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you know, the black orderlies. But anyway, so the town has changed a little bit, but not certainly significantly enough for my liking. And I guess that's about all I can say about that. Hopefully you've experienced more change than I have.
Very good, thank you. And Pádraig, kind of a similar question, but really, you know, Northern Ireland signed a peace agreement in 1998, so that brought a formal close to what we heard about here of kind of decades of violence on the news. But of course there are still divisions, just like here, some of the economic divisions, inequality, and segregated schools, which actually I think a lot of Americans don't even know. It's certainly not something I knew before I started visiting there, that the public schools remain segregated. So how do you describe the current moment of where you are?
I look at the question of Ireland with a brief view of the last 200 years, because anything that's happening today always has to take into context the context of history. So in the early 1800s, the British declared this new thing called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. That was not a democratic declaration. That was it was just the latest assumption in already at that stage 300 years of colonisation. In 1900, when there had been a movement for independence, when the British left, they drew this border, British border in Ireland. It's not an Irish border; it's a British border in Ireland, and created this new state called Northern Ireland, which formerly was called a Protestant state for a Protestant people. Now, this has nothing to do with what you view about the Bible or heaven or that. It's everything to do with Protestant people would tend to have been British identified. It's all to do with territory and understanding of identity. That had a formal policy with no hiding of segregation, of keeping Catholics out from senior civil jobs. And now here we are in 2019, and Brexit's happening, and the border that we had worked so hard to diminish is more than likely going to have escalated attention. Well, it already has escalated attention. It's likely to have border controls. And most of the western border between County Donegal and County Derry, that is part of the border of this territory called Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Most of that is farmland and goes through farms. Some of that border goes through houses. And so technically you've got houses that are now half in the European Union and half outside the European Union. 20 years ago our peace agreement, and peace agreements are only the beginning of peace, not the achievement of peace. And conflict takes as long to de-escalate as it took to escalate. So the only measurement really, a humble measurement for what Irish peace looks like will be 70 years after the Good Friday Agreement. We're only 20 years after the Good Friday Agreement. And that's a humble estimation to think that the British-Irish complexities began with the formation of the border. Really, you should be thinking at least 200 years with the assumption that Ireland wanted to be part of anything called a kingdom, where our language was made illegal, where our way of being, where a famine, which we never called the potato famine because it wasn't, it was a policy famine like most famines, where you need to look into the complexity about who's winning the language, the battle of language, who's getting the right to call what. Whoever called the New World was an early spin doctor, because it wasn't new, it was as old as the rest of the world, and had its own people living peaceably, or unpeaceably there, but nonetheless living there for a long time, who didn't need to be discovered because they'd already discovered themselves. So there's the battle of language for me is an enormous one. In 1968, obviously, there was the beginning of civil rights, and there was a group called the IRA who took advantage of the civil rights movement in Ireland and turned the energy for that into, they escalated it into violence. But that was despicable violence in return for despicable violence. I wholeheartedly condemn the IRA's campaign of terrorism, as well as wholeheartedly condemning the project of colonisation, which rooted us at that stage, had reduced our population in Ireland from 9 million in 1845 to 4 million in 1900. Well, it's not a surprise, but the Irish people who left Ireland throughout the famine, I'm sure lots of them are your grandparents. People who have suffered don't necessarily learn from the suffering. So Irish people came here and were part of the Trail of Tears in terms of supervising and policing that Trail of Tears. One of the first people to send support to Ireland during the famine were the Choctaw Nation, who had learnt about the Irish famine from one of the people that was displacing them. And they sent $170. And there is a monument now and a scholarship fund going on. But wouldn't it have been far better had people who suffered thought, let's not pass on the suffering. Frederick Douglass has this thing to say, the Irish will rue, R-U-E, Irish will rue their lack of integrity. So I think Irish people love to remember our past as victims, but often love to conveniently forget our past as perpetrators. So that's where we're at the moment when it comes to the question of...
Very good.
That's the short answer.
I know. I'm just thinking, every time I have worked with peace builders from many different countries and I ask a question like, tell me about the current moment. I even have said like, tell me about the last 10 years, and they're always like, the immediate words are 200 years ago. But then maybe we should be doing that a bit more. And I think that notion that Pádraig has raised around language and competing narratives is part of the Buffalo moment now, right? The new Buffalo and what does that mean, depending on who you are. So we'll definitely talk more about that. But I'd love each of you to just share a bit about your organizations, and the reason we're here is because that work and those organizations have really centered the arts in your work for change as well. So Lorna, as you mentioned, Ujima is in its 41st year. Congratulations. Ujima means collective work and responsibility in Swahili. And you've said that you use theater as a tool to shape and reflect our lives. So can you just tell us more about that as the founding mission for Ujima, and what does that mean in your work today?
Okay, well, the founding mission, yes, that's true. And the founding mission also included, simply put, I'm a child of the 60s. Some of you may have some familiarity with the 60s, or at least you saw the movie. I'm a child of the 60s, and a very well-known common revolutionary principle in the 60s was seize the means of production. That's not a concept that was born in this country, it was born elsewhere, but everyone who considered themselves to be in some way revolutionary understood what that means, seize the means of production. So I started Ujima Company so that we would seize the means of production. It is true, any city you go into, that people of color, and of course my concern at the time was African Americans first and foremost, while we create art that is exploited and serves to great benefit the United States, we seldom reap the benefits ourselves. And we always find ourselves in the position of having to wait, frankly, for white folks to hire us. And so I thought, well, that won't work. I'm born to be a theater artist. I need a theater. I need to seize the means of production. So I called a meeting of, it was 27 additional people who felt the same way, and we started a theater company, period, the end. Yes, everybody told us we couldn't possibly succeed. And we're still here. We outlived Studio Arena is the way I like to look at it. with probably 1% of their resources, if that. But the idea was first to seize the means of production. Why? So that we could be self-determining. Self-determination is very much at our core. And we formed ourselves as a collective. We didn't know anything about creating a collective. We simply spoke it into existence. And then we decided what a collective was for ourselves. And it worked. And not just me, but everybody in the company had a plantation job. There was never the expectation that we would make a living doing Ujima. And that was and thank God for that, right? Because we never did. So we wanted to do that, seize the means of production so that we could be self-determining, build the beloved community. In any of our literature, you'll see those words used. Yes, I'm a student of Martin Luther King. I was not when he was alive. I was a student of Malcolm X when he was alive, but I was still coming into my maturity. I reconciled those two ideas as an adult. But I was a student of Martin Luther King in that I studied his nonviolence philosophy, which didn't originate with him, but that's not the story I'm telling. And I wanted to provide training. That was very important. So that's what we were trying to do. Seize the means of production so that we could be self-determining, build a beloved community, and provide training for other young artists who had the same beliefs that we did. We started and we remain, it's always been a multi-ethnic, multicultural company. But its primary theatrical purpose is the presentation of work from the African American theatrical canon. But we also produce theater from all over the world. We always have. It's not a new thing. And our work is always tied to social justice. We don't do fluff. Okay, so we're not going to do, as much as I love it, we're not going to do You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown, for example. We'll do Exquisite Guy in Natural Death, which we did by Melvin Van Peebles. So we'll do musicals, but we don't do fluffy musicals. So that's our purpose. And that was your question.
Yeah.
What was our purpose? That's our purpose.
Very good. And Pádraig, as I said, you've just completed a 5-year term as community leader at Corrymeela, this large peace organization. So can you tell us, because I know the answer and it's very interesting, how you came to that organization or what your first role there was, and also just share what is really the heart of the work there.
Okay. Corrymeela, it's an old Irish word, meaning, what somebody once said it means hill of harmony, which when a peace organisation was starting off in 1965 just sounded delicious, magnificent, well-meaning people at a hill of harmony. 10 years later, an actual etymologist of Old Irish came and said, it does not mean hill of harmony, it means lumpy crossing place. At which stage the troubles had broken out. We were like, definitely, this is a much more appropriate place. In Ireland, it's always important to know the name of a place. The name of a place gives you something about what the meaning is. And so, the townland is called Corrymeela, which apparently in Old Irish, which is very different from contemporary Irish, means lumpy crossing place. I'll tell you a little bit about the origins afterwards, but I came there first. Corrymeela addresses particularly the dynamics of British-Irish relations, and British-Irish relations have been troubled for 700 years, and so the unfortunate, and the fortunate truth is that the only way forward is together when it comes to the question of British-Irish relations. We can't say, go, horse, whatever, leave. Different people have tried in our context, but that doesn't work. And so there needs to be a way of being with each other, but being with each other in a way that acknowledges power, rather than just says, well, we're the benevolent ones, why don't you settle down, and then it'll all be lovely. That is not peace. That is, that's the makings of war, basically, to start with. So, in addition to addressing political and community divisions, Corrymeela also, for a long time, is one of the only places in Ireland that was a place of spirituality, also a place fully open to LGBT people. And so I came there first as a gay man going to a retreat, thinking this is the only place in Ireland that I knew where as a gay man I could turn up to a retreat and not be forced to choose between one thing and another when it came to myself. I'm very interested in religion. I'm not sure that I'm a good religious person, but I'm very interested in it. And I also am a gay man. And being forced to deny being gay, or I've been through exorcisms and reparative therapies, etc., and all those kind of forced ideas. So Cornmill was a great place of reconciliation for myself with myself, as well as myself with my story. Shortly after that, I got invited to become poet in residence at Cornmill, and I was poet in residence for 10 years. Sometimes that was full-time, sometimes that was part-time, working alongside groups of people who had been through deeply divided experiences. These were always very carefully curated. People had full choice to participate. It wasn't just, a random choice. Nobody had anything like this forced on them. Group facilitation needs always to be done in such a way that it's safe to join and safe to leave, and it's easy in and easy out. Because for some people, a short-term experience of that is a great thing, and then it's also a great thing to say, yeah, that's enough for them, rather than thinking you have to be forced through to some kind of arbitrary conclusion that's been judged by somebody else to be successful reconciliation. So I worked in that context for 10 years and then became the leader 5 years ago in 2014. So I led for the last 5 years. Having a poet as a leader, a poet doing governance is not a good thing. I tended to become quite fixated on the semicolons, and people were like, the conflict would escalate. People would say, let's look at our governance document. Like, well, I've been looking at it. I'm a longer version. So, Cornmill is a place that works to transform division through human encounter. We are based, I suppose, on the idea that when there are policies that have been put in place for decades, if not centuries, to keep people apart, that it can be a radically subversive thing to bring people together. And that from that, there is a voice of power that can then speak to the well-established policies that are invested in keeping people apart. And so there is a public nature to private encounter. And it was begun in 1965 by a clergyman, Reverend Ray Davey, who had been a prisoner of war in Germany. He had been a volunteer padre with the YMCA. He had been captured in North Africa and then sent through prisoner of war camps in Italy and then into Germany. He witnessed the destruction of Dresden in 1945, and seeing his liberation from a prisoner of war camp came from the destruction of Dresden, which is considered a war crime now. And he thought that if so-called peace can only come with the absolute annihilation of the other, well then we have something serious to pay attention to. He moved back to Ireland in 1945. This division between North and South wasn't even 25 years old at that stage. That border was only expected to be there for 4 years. It's coming up to 100 now. And so he saw that there was the fires were burning for there to be a re-emergence of troubles. Trouble comes from the Irish word tribloid. Well, trouble in our imagination comes from the Irish word tribloid, which means bereavement. And so when we speak about the troubles, we're speaking about the bereavements. And he started off a centre where people could meet each other and talk, not for the sake of consensus. He and I and most people involved in Cornmill are uninterested in consensus, because consensus is this fake imagination of some common ground and some fence in between us all where we don't think strongly about things. The project of democracy is a project of vibrant, engaging, creative argument, and the spark and electricity that comes from that is fascinating. Peace is not the absence of argument. Peace is the absence of violent conflict and the absence of severe threat to each other. And so we're interested in Cornmill in creating the situation where argument can be enlivening, and people's fear of argument can be diminished, and people's practicing of power of threat can be exposed. So we work with about 10,000 people every year come through our programs. Some of those programs are half a day long, some of them are 2 weeks long, working on programs across schools, communities, politics, international dynamics, emerging dynamics as the demographics of the north of Ireland change. We work with all Scottish and English and groups from all across Ireland, as well as international visiting groups. We've got partnerships with Korea, because Korea, as a partitioned country, has curiosity about Ireland as a partitioned country and what the quality of cross-border relationships are or aren't, what are cross-border bodies happening. So we make resources for schools, we make resources for faith groups. We've got a big project at the moment looking at the Book of Ruth. We're looking at Brexit through the lens of the Jewish Book of Ruth, which is a fascinating book about displaced widowed women crossing borders, and that is a timeless story. And thankfully, the divine isn't an annoying character in it. It's an extraordinary story about women taking resources in their own hands and creating the survival that they're celebrated for. And so it's an extraordinary text. So that's the main post of the work we do.
Very good. And One thing that is so interesting what you just said is that the work is to address policies that divide people. And I think that's something that would be so interesting to think through. I mean, obviously in that context, the policies that divide people have been obvious. There have probably also been some that have been less visible, but I think, you know, in the American history, we certainly had some obvious ones, but in the more recent history and in our Buffalo context, there are policies that divide people, like urban planning and redlining and bank lending, that have not been as visible. So we don't have programs to address and redress those policies because it was kind of done in this quiet, less visible way. So that's something I'd love to think through, is maybe how can art point us to those invisible policy divides as well. But so, as you mentioned, Pádraig, you came first as poet in residence, and I'd love just kind of one or two more words on what does it mean, what does that role look like for a community change organization to have an artist in residence. I think you shared with me that you've also had watercolorists and other forms of artists in residence, and then maybe share one of your poems that emerged from that time.
Sure. Artists in residence in the context of conflict-based dialogue, and the idea is, particularly as a poet, is to listen to words. My training is in theology of conflict and poetry, and all of those things center around language. And I'm really interested in how language, and especially language that we consider casual, language like troubles, language like new world, language like things that are just accepted as if they're as ordinary as porridge or bread. Things you want to take those things and undo them and create a new way into those words in order for people to think of a new way of imagining their civic society. So for years I'd work with groups. They'd be in group facilitation, and we'd be there to listen, to pick up on language, and then I'd start with a kind of a community poetry process. I'd come back the next week to that group session with a poem that I'd drafted and say, what do you think? Do you want to change? How would you finish that off? How would you edit this? How would you do it? And it becomes a community poetry idea. Sometimes I'd start off a poem and it might be in 3 distinct parts, and to say, do you want to write a 4th? You know, one time I was working with a group of people and said, here's a poem I wrote about last week, what's your criticism of it? And giving literary criticism to the community from which the text derives is, I think, a great democratic process regarding art, because art is always on the ground, and no art can achieve the supreme brilliance of the human condition. Art is always subsidiary to the kind of to spoken language, rather than verbal art. Sometimes has this reputation of being an elevated form of language. It's not an elevated form of language. Elevated form of language is the human person speaking to another human person, or to himself. So anyway, one time in the group, somebody said, I hate this poem. I'm like, why? And she said, it doesn't say fuck enough. And what an extraordinary criticism. Because it's true. She said, if your stuff is going to make sense, and if it's going to witness the power and destructive power and the threat and the appeal of everything, you need to use much stronger language, which is great. I never need an excuse to swear, so I was delighted. So anyway, here's the poem. We have a lot to do with other zones in the world that are also experiencing conflict, and where the phrase in Irish is Nínearc gur chur le chéile, there's no strength without being with each other. And so certainly we've had long-standing connections with South Africa, with the Balkan region, with Israel and Palestine, and emerging now with Korea. And so this was a piece written. There was a whole bunch of people from a whole variety of places and conflict zones across the world talking together. And what interested me is that most people, the amount of times that people made reference to what it was like to realize that the conflict you thought was absolutely normal was not normal elsewhere. There's a poem called Pedagogy of Conflict, and it's in 3 parts. The first part is about somebody who's lying because in the context of Northern Ireland, anybody who worked with the police was considered a target. So up until today, every person working with the police, whether as a consultant or as a senior inspector, would check under their car for a bomb first thing in the morning. And so children were taught how to lie, to not, you know, if somebody said, what do your parents do? They'd always say, oh, you know, they work in the fire station, or they work in the civil service. The second one is from somebody who lived in a paramilitary house, where every house, every door had a lock, and they were told never answer the door even if you think it's a friend. And then the third part was where a linguistic debate broke out among members of paramilitary organizations during one of the sessions I was facilitating, where one of them said, I murdered someone, and somebody else said, you didn't murder somebody, lives were lost. Somebody else said, I took a life. So there was this linguistic discussion about what language do you use regarding the deaths that happened as part of your campaign. And then somebody said I only ever shot at legitimate targets. Somebody else said I suppose I was one of those legitimate targets when your organisation shot at me and I was taking notes in the corner. So here's the point. The pedagogy of conflict. When I was a child, I learned to lie. When I was a child, my parents said that sometimes lives are protected by an undetected lie of deception. When I was a child, I learned to lie. Now I am more than 25 and I'm alive because I've lied and I'm lying still. Sometimes it's the only way of living. When I was a child, I learned that I could stay alive by obeying certain rules. Let your anger cool before you blossom bruises on your brother's shoulder. Always show your manners at the table. Always keep the rules and never question. Never mention certain things to certain people. Never doubt the reasons behind legitimate aggression. If you compromise or humanize, you must still even out the score and never open up the door. Never open up the door. Never, never, never open up the blasted door. When I was a child, I learned that I could stay alive by obeying certain rules. Never open up the door. When I was a child, I learned that I could stay alive. When I was a child, I learned to count to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But these days I've been counting lives. So I count 1 life. 1 life. 1 life. 1 life. 1 life. Because each time is the first time that life has been taken. Legitimate target has 16 letters and 1 long, abominable space between 2 dehumanizing words.
I think that turns us to where I want to go for our final conversation before we turn to your questions and your examples. Because we also invited folks to bring an example from your work of when a piece of art, a work of art, broke you into a new conversation or a new moment. But you know, Pádraig's stories, I think, very dramatically show this different use of language and these different terms. And on a different scale, we're going through that in Buffalo too, as we said, right? So the new Buffalo, the Renaissance, what do these terms mean? What priorities are we setting for development? Who belongs? We drove around a little bit and went by the medical campus, and I talked about the fruit belt behind, and you know, so it's all part of that story. There was actually a fascinating thing I didn't share, and I'm sure a lot of you saw the stories showing that just by algorithm, wasn't it, that Google Maps and some other sites had started to change the name of the fruit belt neighborhood to medical campus, right? We have one of the leaders here with us, so just that importance of language and naming and words. So yeah, these competing narratives, and it seems to me like we talk about competing narratives, but usually there's one dominant narrative and there's one trying to fight its way up, right, to also be in the mix. So really in moments like that, and Belfast and Buffalo are not in dissimilar economic development moments, right, of pushing for these big, large development projects. So how do you see art in those contexts as a tool to start new conversations or to address and change that language of the mainstream story that's out there? Both of you.
I'm still working with the door.
Yes.
The door. I'm a newsaholic, so I saw the story. I believed it too. And ICE raided while the children were at school. I've worked with children. I worked with a child. I was the first executive director of Buffalo Prep. Quiet as it's kept, that was me. And I had a child the English teacher came into my office and said, you have to come out to the quad. Tamara can't bring herself to come into class. So I went out to see what was going on with Tamara. These were children, they were 7th graders. And she was very upset because when she got home, yesterday when she and her mother and her sister got home, her father had changed the locks so they couldn't get in. And they stayed the night at the hotel. But Mama doesn't have enough money for a hotel again. So when school is out today, I don't know where to go. And there was something about your door that brings all of those things back to my mind about the children who don't know. The door has 2 sides to it. This is my point. But at any rate, what was your question? I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry at all. I mean, I think that's the perfect point, right? Like, we are in a city where we are talking about prosperity and New Buffalo and development, and those stories are happening all around us, right? We have the huge child poverty rate.
Yes, and homelessness.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure,
and that's,
homeless.
I think, quite intentionally not the story that a lot of folks want to tell about Buffalo. We need to turn the page and stop talking about those stories and talk about big, new, shiny stories. So I think that's the perfect of, like, how have you, as someone with that education and that child-focused background, how have you used the arts to lift up those stories maybe, or to break through the big story that is being pushed about Buffalo?
Well, I'm of course still trying to figure that out. The big story, and I hear it on national news too. There's a lot of reference to this Renaissance, and that story for me is like that myth is parallel to this other myth that we're getting out of Washington, D.C. There's some kind of prosperity going on in the country. Unemployment is way down. Everybody's making a gaggle of money. I don't know any of these people. Everybody I know is unemployed. So I don't even know what they're talking about. And that's the truth, Ruth. Okay? I don't know what they're talking about. Everybody that I knew that was unemployed on November 2nd of 2016 is still unemployed. We are holding back and failing gentrification like this. Our sister Denise Barr is here from the Fruit Belt. And you may not know about the Fruit Belt Land Trust, but if you don't know, Google it. Please Google it. So we're having this renaissance, but the poor people that built this nation are still trying to cover the basics. Okay? Like, I live here. Please don't build a giant wall at the foot of my neighborhood. Thank you. And when you go into the medical corridor and you stand on Michigan, what do you see? You see this giant wall that didn't used to be there. The wall is everywhere. Be careful with this wall concept. What are they walling up? I'm not feeling the Renaissance. My company is 41 years old, and we're a tenant in a building. I love our new space. I am not complaining. It's a blessing. But is it adequate for our needs? Does it meet the demands of a professional theater company, which I insist we are? No, it does not. I've got kids playing basketball down the hallway while I'm trying to rehearse. Do they have that problem at Irish Classical? No, they do not. Don't talk to me about a renaissance. I know a renaissance when I smell one, and I don't smell one. This to me looks like everything else. It really does. And I can't say enough about how poor our leadership is. Our leadership is just poor. You talk about disabled. That's where the disability is. In the Common Council, there is no renaissance. I don't know anyone who's enjoying this renaissance. I don't know anyone that's employed to capacity. I don't know anyone who's running an organization that literally serves community, not exploits, not extracts, but serves community. I don't know anyone running one of those institutions that has sufficient resources to do the job they're trying to do. And they keep right on doing it. They work all day and all night. There is no renaissance. I don't know what they're talking about. I don't mean to talk about your landlord, but we're sitting in one of these places. Go on the subsidy tour. Next time, Push Buffalo and etc. do a subsidy tour. You get on a little school bus. I went in the wintertime, lousy weather. You get on a school bus and they take you to all the places where we have put money into this renaissance, these huge tax breaks, $57 million. If you give tax breaks of that size to the people who have $57 million, then who the hell is paying the taxes? How the hell are we going to support an infrastructure on the money that people like Lorna Hill make? Okay? But you exempt these people from paying taxes. This can't work. This is what killed Los Angeles. Okay? This City of Courts, read the book. They're all over. There's no renaissance. This is bullshit. This is bullshit.
And if I may, my friend Lorna, one thing that I find that Ujima does so brilliantly, in addition to bringing works of art from, as you said, all over the world, is also tell the stories of what you're talking about, what's happening here. And so one example is we do shared work around lead exposure in children and the old housing stock that we have in Buffalo that on the one hand is beautiful and on the other hand, literally encloses people, traps them into houses with all these health hazards. And so PPG, we did interviews with tenants and mothers and landlords and housing court attorneys, and your team at Ujima took that and created this really moving, very short play that's a day in the life of a single mom, from home to her kids' experience at school to housing court, who has went through the experience of severe lead exposure. And so maybe you can talk just a little bit about, I'm sure some people who've seen Free Fred Brown, some people here have probably seen it, but if you could just even say, what was that project? Because I think what you've done is capture the essence of the deep frustration that you were sharing.
So first of all, I want to say this. Don't use the word political in my presence, because my work is not political. It's just justice, that's all. There's nothing political about it, it's just justice. So we created this 7-minute piece, Legacy of Lead, which, as Andrea has just explained, very quickly takes you from the home and shows you the child in school, shows you the courtroom, shows you the failure of the system to address what's happening to this family. It's only 7 minutes long, and we've done it at various places. This past weekend, it was the curtain raiser for the production Free Fred Brown, which I'll also say something about. But every place we've taken it, no matter who the audience is, a community group, everybody in the t-shirt, an anti-violence community group, or the community foundation, or any place we've taken it, the response has been so positive, so strong. Over a 7-minute piece, there's an amazing amount of information that you can give, yes, in 7 minutes, but more significantly, I think, there's an amazing amount of movement you can cause in a person's heart and soul in 7 minutes, and it doesn't always require words, and this little tiny piece does that. Every time I see it, I cry, and I've seen it more than anybody. Free Fred Brown is a full 2-hour production. It's a devised theater piece that it took us a year to create. We pulled together some actors who wanted to help create it, and we met every Saturday for a full year, and then we performed it first in June of 2017, and we're still performing it. We just performed it last weekend. If you can rustle up some money, we can bring it to your institution. We don't always do it in a theater. This weekend we did it in our new theater with lighting, and the actors I had to constantly remind them in rehearsal, don't move till a blackout, because they've done it in so many community settings where there was no lighting. They're used to freeze and then go. No, you got lights today. But Free Fred Brown is based on true stories strung together to make one larger picture. It was inspired originally by a member of our company back in like 1982. We first did it in 83. The first version of it was in 83. He was arrested for theft of services from what was then called National Fuel. Remember National Fuel? National Fuel Gas. I think it had 3 words. He was arrested for theft of services. He lived with his mother and his 2 sisters. It was winter. They were freezing. His mother asked him to go outside and turn the gas back on, which he did. I don't know if you've ever done that. I've done that. Turn the gas back on. There are people who can teach you how. But his mother and his sisters subsequently moved to Wyoming. So when the police came in the spring to arrest someone, he was the only person living there, so he was arrested. The penalty for theft of services is 6 months. And that's what he got, 6 months. Now, we found out he had been arrested because we're at rehearsal and he doesn't show up. He's always at rehearsal. He's already in the room when we get there. He may be asleep between some chairs, but he's there. So as soon as he wasn't there, and this is pre-cell phone, I said, spread out, call the police stations and the hospitals, and that's how we found it. In that same time frame, another member of our company, she was publicist for the company at the time, she lost her job. She worked for what was then called Niagara Mohawk. That was the name of the electric company when I first came to Buffalo. She was fired for loaning money to a client to pay his bill. The phone calls are monitored, and she was heard loaning a client who was unable to pay his electric bill. She loaned him money, she lost her job. So those 2 factors I put together in 1983 and created a play for what was then called Black Mountain College 2. Black Mountain College 2, I think, is no longer in existence. So our play has a lot of other things in it too. We explore the rape hike that was threatening our community 2 years ago. There are just a lot of different things, and the play has an opportunity to point out what is happening with the racism in our school system, which everybody wants to ignore because the principal is black. So we get a chance to point that up. So the play is about a community trying to come together to find just solutions for itself. Okay? Trying to encourage an audience, stop looking to someone else. Stop assuming that the experts, in point of fact, there's not a problem. Any problem that all of us in this room share, all of us in this room can solve it. Okay? We don't need that lady going out the door right there. I don't care who she is. We can solve it right here. If we allow everybody to participate, we have open and honest conversation. And that could be tricky. So that's what that play is about. And as I said, we've been doing it for 2 years.
Very good, yeah. And I've been there and seen the lead play. I mean, that's part of what we want to talk about today. It's so interesting that, we've been going in for years to these same groups, the Community Foundation board members. Here's the statistics on lead poisoning. Here's what we know. Not getting a response. This play comes in and now it's all they want to talk about, right? So it's amazing. So Pádraig, yeah, quick answer, and then we'll turn back to folks. Doesn't have to be quick. How do you see art as a tool to start new conversations? Or maybe you have this specific story to share of another moment when, whether a poem, a play, a story, really changed the discussion.
Well, I'll tell you an example where we're working with 2 communities, 2 nearby villages, one predominantly British identifying, one predominantly Irish identifying, so Protestant Catholic in the regular parlance. And there had been a murder between these 2 villages, and after a period of time, folks from community leaders from both villages had asked for community facilitation. And so Susan McEwen, who at that stage was program leader for Cornelia, came and devised this project. And we worked for 26 weeks with individual members in the community, bringing people together, looking at rites of passage in life and looking at shared narratives as well as unshared narratives, because part of the art of peace is finding the capacity to talk where you don't have shared common ground. common ground only works when there's common ground. What happens when you've got different ground? The idea that that needs to be frightful or fearful is a really limited imagination to communicate. It can be interesting to learn something that you do not share. And so this community poetry project was part of it, as well as there was a sketch artist, and whenever anybody was telling a story, she would sketch images. And then people also contributed their own stories. And by the end of 26 weeks, we had a gallery, a little bit like this, and we had poetry and sketches and some photographs. Everybody invited 10 people from their own community, and so we had this magnificent opening. But the folks in the community were saying, these are our stories up there, and I edited that part, and I put that bit in, and this was mine. And so, similarly, if anybody was taking notes, we had the sketch artist is also an extraordinary photographer, so she took beautiful, lighted photographs of people's handwriting when they were writing down something. So it was thoroughly recognizable handwriting, not in terms of whose handwriting it was, but recognizable as ordinary and the calligraphy of the everyday. And having that blown up huge to escalate and elevate certain words that became this curated space that then we invited community leaders to. People were nervous because they were saying to participate in such a thing like you seem to collaborate with the enemy, and those phrases are very powerful in the north of Ireland as well as across lots of places. So doing those ideas came from that to then say, what is it that we want some local community funding to be targeting? What are the bigger powers that are going on that are going to continue to request and require these kinds of painful human experiences, so we can just get distracted by the pain of this particular family rather than thinking, who's creating that? Who's creating that over and over again, this repeated pattern, this repetition compulsion? Whose compulsion is that? The individuals or some policy that needs to be challenged, and how can we look at civic change as for that? So those are the kinds of projects that we would do.
Very good. Now I'd love to take some questions from you all, or as I said, we invited folks to also, if you do have an example to share as well, to bring it today. Yes.
I just wanted to share, I so appreciate your poems. I'm still trying to unpack that, because as some of us are parents in the role of children who have been murdered, and that trauma that we carry with us all the time, consistently. And much to your example, you know, how words, a word can take you right back to a moment, and we don't recognize the importance sometimes, the value of that, and there are so many things in what you're talking about, but not talking about at the same time, that are so heartfelt. You know, I just wanted to express to you that gratitude, because, you know, when you put together words and you form sentences, you have intent and you have meaning, but you don't always understand how it can really adapt, and it can help somebody else in a situation, or it can speak to another situation entirely. You know, there's so much trauma in our society that we never ever talk about.
Yeah.
We don't deal with that, because the issue of the day is, you know, be good, be well, go ahead, get on with your life, you know. So I just wanted to speak that to you. Thank you. So true.
As a poet, I'm very interested in time. I blame Emily Dickinson. And I hear the way people use language in politics sometimes is when somebody, I was in England recently, and somebody was talking about Brexit, and I said, well, obviously, you know, the partition of Ireland in around 1921, the fact that this is coming up in the 100th anniversary of this, Brexit is really almost diabolically composed as an artistic way to communicate, actually we're turning back the clock. And the person said, and this is a well-meaning liberal person who considered himself to be, you know, good, and I'm sure they are, but said, what are you talking about the past for? I was like, the past that you consider is not the past for us. The past for us is, I just recently got this new green card that I need to show to prove that I can drive across the border. That is border monitoring. Because who's taking account of that? How is that being monitored? And so this idea that the past, sometimes people want to say that I'm telling you something you know, but the idea that the past, is the luxury of the comfortable.
Amen. Amen.
And the unaccountable.
Yes.
Wow. Thank you so much, the three of you. You're three powerhouses. It's an honor to be in your presence. The things you've said, the things you've shared are so stimulating. I will do my very best to keep it concise. When I heard your poem, sir, and I heard the line, when I was a child, for me that echoed the Bible. And I'm not somebody who has studied the Bible, but when I was a child, I spoke as a child. And part of what I think may be the trauma is that we want to hear those things. Yes, when I was a child, I spoke as a child. Now I put away childish ways. The sort of normal cycle of the human lifespan. But in fact, what we heard were, you better lie all the time. You better keep your front door locked. You better, these things which are traumatic. And so that echo and that surprise of, really in a way there isn't a childhood, is there? And the other thing that I wanted to say to this lady's personal and touching comments is that I think part of the problem that we have in this culture is that we don't really have thorough, consistent rituals around death and mourning, especially when it is a tragedy. And without disclosing where I work, and some of you may, there's a person at my work whose child was murdered a few weeks ago. And she's coming back to work today. And an email went out to the entire company of 125 people. And don't overwhelm her with your condolences. Don't overwhelm her with your condolences. Her child, not a teenager, a child was murdered in a completely innocent situation. And I'm thinking, how American is that? Let's not talk about it. Let's not deal with it. And I'm not saying she needs 125 people to bring her to the point of tears when she's trying to do some data entry on her computer. But there's something to be said. One, maybe she should have a little more time off with pay. With pay. And no, you don't get over it. You might eventually kind of sort of get through it, but you don't get over it. Why would you? Why would someone? It's a human being, your loved one. Now I'm just entering into the babble zone, but the three of you are all so powerful and so special and so inspiring that it is, for me, an honor to be here at this time and place and to hear your words and your stories and to hear the tremor in your voice, which resonates in every single heart in here.
I'd like to respond to that if I may. I feel you 5,000 times. Absolutely, that is part of what needs to happen. Give the woman more time off, because of course what does happen, I know when I lost my grandson, I took 2 weeks off. I was teaching at the public school. I had to take 2 weeks off for bereavement. Then you have to go back to work. And I wasn't ready to go back to work. It's my first grandchild. He was 7 years old. You know, I was not ready. But when I arrived, the administrators all told me, Lorna, if there's anything you need, just let me know. And as soon as I started saying what I need, the answer was no, I'm tired. I need someone in the room with me. So I had my niece, ex-military, volunteer. She volunteered. She said, I'll go with you, Auntie. And she was there, and I just needed somebody to do simple things like take the roll, just help me get my top of my day started. Then the principal let me know that that was not permissible. In fact, the principal told me we don't really allow volunteers, and they have to be fully vetted. I noticed that he brought volunteers in, but he wasn't bringing my volunteer in. So then I thought, okay. So I had my daughter come, because she had graduated from that school the year before, and I thought, well, everybody knows her, I'll bring her. First day she was there, I was told, no, you can't have. So, oh, okay, so I have to go up there by myself. I have to go, and I really needed that support. I really, really needed that, but I could not get it. I could not get it, and being the star teacher in the drama department didn't help one bit. It didn't earn me a damn thing. So I feel you on that, yeah. Leave the sister alone. Let her stay at home. You want to do something for her. Give her 2 months, and then ask her if she's ready to come back to work. That's what I wanted to say about that. I feel you.
I would like to acknowledge how educational it was to hear these two perspectives that were in theory in these faraway locations from each other. So similar to hear your experiences in the way you use art and the way you use activism and just your presence and your existence in the community to make change and to influence us and to teach us. And it was just the synergy between you two was so powerful. So I thank you. I appreciate you deciding these two luminaries needed to be in the same room and interact. That was a blessing for us. So thank you.
Thank you.
If I may just back up, I want to back up because Andrea had me talk about legacy of lead and Free Fred Brown, but I want to say this as well. Another thing that we do is Unheard Voices. Every now and then we come out with an Unheard Voices project. The first one we did was on refugee and immigrant women. And Unheard Voices is always in response to a problem, to an issue that someone has brought to our door and asked us to do something, to create some kind of artistic response to it. So the first one we did, we had 6 women from 6 different countries, one of which didn't speak English, so she had to bring a translator with her. And over like 6 months, we created this piece. But it was in response to the issue that was brought to our door was the medical community is not prepared. They're not culturally competent to deal with this influx of immigrants. They often don't know what to do, and it goes beyond finding a translator. Can you somehow make that plain? So we had to narrow it down. We're just going to do women. We can't do everybody's story. And we had these 6 women give us their stories, tell us their stories, and we decided what kind of context to put it in. We decided, because they were from all over the world, to have a big screen where we could show on a map literally their travels. One woman had spent like 12 years in a refugee camp in Nepal. She came out of Burma, you know, so you get to see where people came from and how long they landed in one place before they got here. The stories were very meaningful, but what was important about doing that kind of event was that we focused on getting an audience from the medical community, because they're the ones who need to hear these stories. They're the ones who need to start a conversation. And they showed up in droves. It was very satisfying. But in telling the stories, the little piece that we didn't see coming that was a blessing, in telling their stories, of course, the needs of the women came out in the story, right? So the woman, for example, Sharifa, who did not speak English, her story included the loss of her children. She had to flee her country, and when she fled her country, the children ended up in the custody of her husband, who no longer wants her, but he wants to keep the children. She hadn't talked to her children. So someone had leftover phone cards from some program. You know, they give you a phone card, you're nice, here's one. They had a bunch of them, like hundreds of dollars of these cards left. One of the women needed a purse, something as simple as a purse. Another woman, she came here from Iraq. Her family assisted the United States when we invaded her country, which meant then that she had to leave her country too. She had been like a doctor or a lawyer there. She came here, she's nobody. She's just some poor woman from some other country. She needed a couch. The bottom line is all of their needs, all of them expressed some need at some point in the evening. And then we got these phone calls. People were donating the things that these women needed. So we spent Christmas delivering these things. And it was like, what a fantastic response. The next one was for people who were unemployed or underemployed. People got jobs. One woman got a job as the director of something or other. What we know is that there are people who want to hear the truth, who want to be of help, and maybe they don't know how to get access to that information. They don't know where to start. So Unheard Voices allowed us to do that. The last one we did was the voices of students and parents from the Buffalo Public School System. And they didn't get any gifts out of that. We got a lot of backlash on that one. But I will say this, the Buffalo Public Schools administrators, they showed up. You know, they were bitter, but they showed up, you know, and for the most part they didn't get the point, but they showed up. So I just wanted to say Unheard Voices is another thing that we do, and we've been recently asked to do one about for homeless teenagers. I don't mind telling them I'm frightened, but that's the next one we want to do. But we also do regular theater too. I want to say that in case you want to buy a ticket.
Oh, we have time, yeah.
I just wanted to make a comment that could lead to a question. But again, I promise this will come back. I used to teach math, and I feel like a lot of times Andrea had mentioned we'll provide information in certain ways, in reports or in data or in this or that, and oftentimes people have a knee-jerk reaction to it. And you can solicit donations or things from people, and oftentimes you might hear crickets. But I think harkening back to what you had mentioned about power, I see and I've observed a lot of these different expressions of art, and that can take a variety of forms, almost take away those elements of power so that people can be more free and less threatened to have the conversations or to do the things that they otherwise might not have. And so I just wanted to, again, express appreciation like everyone else here. But I think that was a huge piece that oftentimes isn't talked about, is the power of it.
Yeah, and I'm gonna get my Irish poet on here. And no, but there's a quote from the Irish poet Seamus Heaney that I've always loved to use in work, where he said there are two big fields of knowledge, the poetic and the practical, and the frontier between them is there for the crossing. And to me, the stories that we heard there, that's like something deep happened and jarring and life-changing, and the only response, the only field of knowing that the company has or that people have is the practical, you know. So where is the poetic response to these tragic events? And on the other hand, the final area of questions that I want to bring to these two is that sometimes those of us who, whether it's in community action or others, try to bring in our poet friends and our artist friends, we're not practical enough for them, right? So what I want to think through is how can we truly center artists and their voices in our work for community change. I was really impressed when I came back to Buffalo that I felt like almost every meeting I went to, whether it was a 6-person working group or a big community event, they would start with an arts opener, watching a short film, bringing in a poem, and that's really beautiful. But someone beside me here has said we really need to push beyond the arts opener. So how can we push beyond saying, stand up, poet, give me your opening, and then sit back down again, to saying, you know, how can we bring these artists who balance the poetic and the practical into the core of our policy work?
Pay your artists.
Yeah.
It would be, it's silly and obvious, but it would be unacceptable to have gotten sandwiches and just said thanks very much to the sandwich shop. You know, our gratitude is your payment. I think when artists are producing something for the benefit of the community, there is such integrity in the production of that. There's time, there's expertise, there's preparation, there's stuff sewn into that, and to commission artists to produce something that would have a life beyond the amount that you pay for it is a really fine thing to do, and it is long lasting, and you contribute then to a portfolio for that artist, so their professional life is going, as well as then contributing to something that goes on far beyond. And so I'm really interested in communities that say, I mean, there's ways that you can say, let's see, who are the local publishing houses, to say, let's see if they've got any funding, let's see, could we work with the local publishing house to commission artists queering Renaissance, for instance. What would that look like? Renaissance is a French word, Renaissance, to be reborn. What is being reborn? So Renaissance implies something that was is coming back again. What is the was that's coming back again now? And wouldn't that be interesting to have that as a condemnation and a cursing, as well as to say, let's truly rebirth something that was. And so wouldn't that be an interesting way to say, who owns that word Renaissance? Who are we allowing to have that? And so, and then to do something curious and long lasting within the context of that would strike me. But to see arts as business, and to treat it as such, and then to not just go to the regular person to whom you go, but to see who are the poets in schools that have been systematically underfunded and overlooked. What are the poetry classes that are happening there where you want to go? Right, let's collaborate to amplify voices that actually have the raw data to be able to write extraordinary poetry or to create extraordinary things that are not just protest poetry or protest art, but are elevating something that has been in plain sight but has been systematically disregarded. So,
if we have corporate welfare, why can't we have artistic welfare?
Well, yeah, and when you get it, please be careful how you put together the panel that decides who gets them.
Yeah.
To tag on to what you were just saying, yes, I'm the person that objects to doing what I call the dog and pony show. And I had to vehemently protest against that with a group of people that I'm working with currently, and everyone got the point. Thank God I was there to make the point, right? Don't trot artists out for the dog and pony show. We should be part of the whole planning. So in other words, it's like everybody in this room has enough sense to know that you can't start something and then say, oops, we don't have anyone of color, and then you invite some person of color that you feel safe with to come join it. We all know that that's not good. You have to create relationships in a legitimate fashion, and you have to bring people to the table when you start, before you have it all planned out. Stop planning shit and then asking us to come be a part of it. Let us be part of the planning, is the point I'm making. Anything you're about to do, you can have artists at the table to cooperate, to collaborate. Believe it or not, they're smart. Okay? That other thing, that Billie Holiday, that was a persona. That's not who she was. Okay? And I could go on. Billie Holiday is the one who comes, not Billie Holiday. Yes. But you know what I mean. The idea is that they are intelligent and capable and educated and all the blah blah. Have them at the table from the beginning. I don't care if you're figuring out what should be the plumbing system in the building. You'd be surprised at the perspective an artist can bring to that conversation. Traditionally, what has happened is as I said before, we're thieves, tramps, and thieves. I don't know how to call that lyric. We're regarded as, I don't know, whores and vandals. And it's just not true. There's a lot of prejudice. That's why in this country, when an actor, some famous actor, George Clooney gets up and says something, and right away the opposition politicians get on television and say, actors need to shut up. We don't want to hear from them. Just keep acting. We don't want to hear. What? Try to find someone that's got a greater breadth of experience than George Clooney. You know what I'm saying? There's just this constant minimalizing, and then if you're of course an artist of color, You have to fight. Remember when the Freedom Wall happened? All right, they had hired somebody from out of town.
Yes.
We weren't gonna be part of it. They would jump right over all the local artists of color and do a thing about black people down the wall, and you could call it the Freedom Wall? Really? You need to investigate your definition of freedom. Stop hiring artists from out of town. Stop hiring people from out of town, period. Every problem we want to solve, if it's a problem we share in this room, we can solve it. We do not need Joe Blow to come in from, Seattle to show us how to pave a road, for God's sake. We need to stop doing that. All right? And we need to demand it of our funders.
Yeah.
We need to demand it of our funders. I got nothing against the Philharmonic, but I want to see a lot more homebred musicians in it. I don't want to see fewer and fewer musicians who are using our orchestra to as a stepping stone to the Boston Philharmonic or the Philadelphia Philharmonic. You dig? You dig?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. We're not a stepping stone.
I think we have time for just one or two, and I saw two hands back there. Yeah.
Well, here's another. Two things that have come in the conversation are gentrification and artists. So here's the other one about artists. What's the relationship between artists and gentrification? The simple thing is to say that artists cause it. I think, it gets said artists move into a neighborhood and then, blah, 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 and the developers come and there's maybe some truth to that observation, but I think there's much bigger things at work. Big cycles of disinvestment and reinvestment. So it's kind of an open-ended question about what role can artists play? I mean, one other thing in terms of thinking about gentrification, the only thing I keep thinking about is that it's colonization. It's the same thing. It's like extract wealth, which is called de-investment. That's really extraction of wealth. And then when the cycle comes back and then exploits the wealth, the lack of it by speculating on it. And so I just wonder, how artists we can make the conversation more complicated than just artist cause gentrification. What can artists do to challenge it, and what can we do to problematize it? So that's
One of the things that I think in that is I hear the hyperbole you're putting forward in terms of artists move into a community and gentrification happens. It's to queer up that sentence as well as to locate it.
Yeah.
Artists are already in the community. Every neighborhood, any block, in any place, there are artists there. So who are we defining as an artist? A person who has a studio, a person who's had the good fortune or good luck or privilege to go to a portfolio class. How about that being recognized that artists are everywhere and finding ways to amplify artists who are and have already been and always been in the local community. And I think there's a woman, Helen, I forget her family name, who works with Broadway Housing in New York City, and she has been insistent as she works with homeless populations in New York City to say we're working with artists, and she is uninterested really that there can be predatory curiosity as to is that artist living on the street or not. She's doing really important work regarding housing provision, but she's saying I'm working with artists, and the idea of using the word artist deliberately in a way that takes it away from the idea that artists are only elite, and to say that people who are approaching their lives with the imagination, that is a radical act of art, and to honour it as such, and therefore it undoes the idea that artists need to move in. Artists have already been living there, and I think there's a politic regarding that also to that, because it's a terrible thing when people in power have to be shocked to realise that they have not imagined that the people who they are displacing are artists. Isn't it terrible that you need to stoop so low as to imagine that person is an artist. Imagine, that's the subtext to that is to say, imagine that person is a person of value, because you clearly haven't so far. And let's shock people into doing that. So it's a bad tactic. I don't like it, but it might be a tactic that will work. That way.
This is a new concept to me. I hadn't heard about artists, but you know what? I'm rolling with the wrong artists, obviously. I hadn't heard about artists causing gentrification. I come from a set of artists that are mostly people of color, and we have never been regarded highly enough to actually change a neighborhood behind me. No, I don't know anything about that. I'm more familiar with artists as being untrustworthy, incapable of administering. I've had funders say to me, if I give you the money, what are you going to do with it? And you want to say, other than what I put on the proposal? I asked a lawyer, big lawyer, raised, if I tell you that part, you'll know who he is. And I asked him to be chairman of our capital campaign when we were on Elmwood. We spent $75,000 trying to build, to renovate that building, and of course eventually had to move anyway. But when I asked him to be chairman of our capital aid campaign, he said, well, you know that means you're going to have to show me the other set of books.
Oh.
And I literally showed you, there's so much I know, but I had no idea what he was talking about. I'm like, what do you mean? I made him be explicit. Well, everybody's got a second set of books. I said, not in Eugene, we don't. You realize how quickly these white folks would put me out of business if I had a second? Are you kidding? Yes, but it was like, everybody does it. Not if they're black, they don't. I'm willing to bet you the African American Cultural Center does not have a second set of books. Agnes is not trying to bring that organization down over some bullshit like a second set of books. I'm telling you, we live in two different countries.
Yeah, but I've heard that that's a narrative that some of our researchers are talking about. It's like loft living. The artists move in, have luxury studios, make the neighborhood
My
cool
question is, what color
for
are
others
they?
to follow. Yeah, I'm sure.
What artist, what does it mean to be an artist, I guess? Like, are you an artist for the banks? Are you an artist for the universities?
Mm-hmm.
Or like what happened with the Freedom Wall, like which artists were they talking to? What does that mean? So I guess when we talk about artists, like what does that mean?
Yeah.
And I think that there's a certain narrative of the artist is you've got to show at this museum or this gallery, or you're not from Buffalo because, if you're an important artist, why would you stay here? That kind of thing. So we got to bring people and do murals. So let's put murals all over the place. But what are the murals doing? What are the value of the buildings when the mural goes on the wall? Like, I don't know. They're just confusing and.
Yeah. So I think we are nearing the end of our time. What I would like to do is maybe violate the dog and pony show by asking Pádraig to close us with a poem in a minute, if that's acceptable. But first, I just kind of want to ask a question, because something also that you said, Lorna, I would love for you to say again, of like, let's go out there, right? You've given us this really cool example of a Renaissance book and questioning that. If you could do any public art and social change project, there were no barriers, nothing was too crazy, what would you do? And you can give your own answer, but I also want you to tell about the cow suits.
Cow folks. If I could do anything, I'm not a visual artist, although I do some visual art, but no one would pay a nickel even for what I create. But if I could do a large piece for the public to see, I would do the case for reparations. I would do that. Because a lot of people don't even want to talk about it because they imagine that it's something impossible, despite the fact that we have reparations in place for other people, but it never occurs to them that you could actually do reparations for the people who built your goddamn country. I would do that. I would do a case for reparations. Because the other thing is because we don't really teach American history in school. We have little select portions that we'll teach you about, but we don't teach you the real scope. Then people could walk by the wall, and as they walk down the wall, they could see, oh, that's what happened. That's what Reconstruction looks like. That's who didn't get the GI Bill. That's what redlining looks like. That's what, you know what I'm saying? They say, oh, I get it. I'm trying to put it into a play, but it's very difficult. A wall, the visual, that's what I do. And what was the second part of your question?
Oh, the cow suits.
Cow folks. So I tried to get some people together, I failed. And then I threatened, I said, I'll buy the first suit. You know a cow suit? Just a cheap Halloween costume, was $35. But I wanted to organize some people who would be willing to wear a cow suit. Unfortunately, I don't have any funding for it, so you have to buy your own suit. But the idea is that we have a group of, I call them cowpokes. And if you have an action happening, then the cowpokes would show up to support your action. For example, if you want to protest in front of Catholic Charities because they have withdrawn their adoption program rather than allow gay people to adopt a child, then the cowpokes show up, right? And people stop because they see all these cows. And they say, what's going on here? And you say, well, we're protesting. You know what I'm saying? Because, you know, when people drive past the protest, they they try to act like they don't see you, the little Lorna. You put on your cowpokes. You have a vacant lot that you want the city to turn over to the community. You have your cows in the lot. Sitting around smoking cigars. And people come over and they say, what's going on here? So we want the city to give this. See my point? So the cow. Now where did I get the idea? It's not original. It's not original. I saw the Bolivian zebras. Okay, right? You saw the Bolivian. If you didn't see it, Google it. The Bolivian zebras. They had this in La Paz or someplace. They had this terrible problem with traffic accidents at this particular intersection, and somebody put on a zebra suit and was able to stop traffic. And then there was more zebras. When I heard about the story, they had gotten to 120 zebras, and there are no people dying at this intersection anymore. It's a very powerful thing, that visual thing. So I wanted to put together cowpokes. Ujima Company Inc.org. You can contact me through my company, through the company that I'm artistic director of, if you'd like to be a cowpoke. I think it's a powerful notion. I really do.
And I remember you said, because a cow can say anything and get away with it.
Who's going to walk up to a cow and be annoyed?
And then, just as you were talking, it made me realize we should also be sure to mention Frontline Arts Buffalo, which is this interesting project now of Ujima and 3 other Frontline Arts groups.
Right.
So maybe you just want to share what that is before we.
Well, Brian Lee is here
Yeah.
from El Museo. Brian, raise your hand up, baby, so everybody can see. Brian's part of it. Frontline Arts Buffalo. So, actually, anyone who wants to be part of it can be. Most of the people at the table are not associated with any arts institution. Zainab is at our table, for example. Sarah's at our table, for example. They are not part of an arts institution. Just people who believe that frontline arts organizations are getting short shrift in the funding situation and any number of other situations. But funding was our principal concern. But our question was, the oldest cultural institutions, arts and cultural institutions in the city of Buffalo are institutions that serve frontline communities first and foremost. Why are they the oldest and the poorest? Why are they able to survive but not thrive? Why are we unable to spawn? And that's a question that we're trying to analyze. And maybe at the end of the day be able to come up with some policy recommendations. Not to say we haven't done that before, but we've never been successful. But the idea of putting FAB together was so that we could speak directly to the community. We've always spoken to the funders. We want to speak directly to the community and hopefully inspire the community to advocate for the organizations that mean the most to you, the institutions that serve you and your children.
And that's the serve you and your children is what's jumped out to me in the conversation around these organizations is, you know, you may have by this point had in your workshops or had in your place 3 generations of the same family in the same neighborhood. So at that point, I mean, you are just so much more than a gallery or an arts organization. You're this core part of the neighborhood structure. So that's just such an important project now too. So Pádraig, a wild idea. What would you do? And then maybe give us another poem to close this out.
What would I do where I am or in Buffalo?
Anywhere, yeah.
I would presume to think I want to learn. At home, I would do something on British-Irish relations, because one of the things that's really clear is that most people in Britain do not know the history of Britain as it comes to its impact on Ireland. Another person last year in England said to me, Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland, which bit do we own? I tried to remember that I technically am a man committed to non-violence. We own. What does that mean?
I
Who's
don't
the we?
know. That's
It's,
horrible.
I mean, the possessive and the curious nature with which you can say that without being ashamed of it. It was overwhelming. So that's what I think I would do something regarding art and colonial history for the education of colonialists. So here's a very short poem. I was going to choose a gentle poem, but I'm not going to, because I don't like it that art is just done to kind of give it a little bit of consolation at the end, but make us all go away and go, oh, isn't that lovely? Art should be disruptive. Art is disruptive, and art is apocalyptic in the sense of that apocalypse isn't about the end of the world; it is about the world as it is. Art apocalypse is a word from Greek theatre, meaning to pull back the curtain to show you what's there. Or another way to say it is to pull the rug from under you, to show you what's under the rug, but also to pull it from under you, just to locate yourself in the place that you've always been. So this is a true poem. It's called Not Yet, and it points to the luxury of imagination, but it's very short. I was sitting around a table, and a young man who's in this poem said something about the Troubles, which is our word for talking about the period from 68 to 98. And there was another man around this table who was a very significant peace man, funder, strategist, etc. And this much older. And the older man said to the younger man, "You're too young to know about the Troubles." So here's a poem called Not Yet. It's short. Not yet. You're too young to know about the Troubles, the peace man said. And the young man said, "Father shot dead, mother fell apart, brother fell into himself, other brother sent to live with others, and me, I smothered everything. I was farmed around, and now years later we have found ourselves back beneath a shared and troubled sea." Not yet. No one's too young to know about the Troubles.
Wow, very nice.
Can you just share the name of your book in case anybody wants to
So we
find
can
those
get
books?
it.
Both of those are from a book called Sorry for Your Troubles.
About tonight.
Oh, and tonight. Yes.
Tonight, Owen and I are doing a service in the cathedral, the Episcopal Cathedral, looking at Celtic spirituality for the first hour, and then after that we're doing a supplementary thing after that of music and poetry.
And it's a fundraiser, right? I mean, part of the money is going toward food.
That's
Yes.
right, yes, there's a food bank that
Food for harvest.
yes, the Dean Pless there in the cathedral has picked a charity that I don't know the exact name of it, but it's one that deals with food shortage in Buffalo,
Yeah.
so the whole theme is around, this is the Celtic time of harvest, or everyone's time of harvest, so there's great Celtic festivals around this time of year, so we're exploring that, what it means to bring home the harvest that we have set forth in ourselves and in our own communities.
So there's more of a kind of a liturgy at 6, and then at 7:30 it will start with poetry and music concert. So yeah.
If you're Welsh, are you welcome?
Absolutely.
All are welcome.
Exactly.
Now, please join me in thanking these two